Being home alone has never bothered me. I actually enjoy the solitude, the quiet, the freedom to do whatever I want. But one night last summer, something happened that made me rethink that comfort. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me in charge of the house. It was a typical night. I made myself some popcorn, turned on a movie, and settled into the couch. The house was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering TV screen. Everything felt normal, until I started hearing the sounds. At first, it was just a faint creaking, like the house settling. I ignored it, figuring it was just the wind or the old wood. But then, the creaking turned into footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be just the house. My heart started to pound as I muted the TV and strained to listen. The footsteps seemed to be coming from upstairs. I was certain I was alone, but the sound of someone moving above me was unmistakable. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal on the roof, or maybe I was imagining things. But the footsteps continued, moving from one side of the house to the other. I felt a chill run down my spine. The popcorn in my lap was forgotten as I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Besides, what would I tell them? That I was hearing footsteps in an empty house. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. It was as if whoever or whatever was up there had realized I was listening. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. The house was deathly quiet, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to check it out. I told myself it was nothing, that I just needed to prove it to myself. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I slowly made my way to the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing in the stillness of the house. I reached the top of the stairs and stood in the hallway, my hand shaking as I pointed the flashlight toward the closed doors. I listened, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I started with the bathroom, nothing. The guest room empty. Finally, I reached my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of darkness peered out at me. I pushed the door open with trembling fingers and swept the flashlight across the room. Empty. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a rush of relief. There was nothing there, just an overactive imagination and an old house making noises. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the closet. "Get out." My heart nearly stopped. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and straight out the front door. I stood on the porch, gasping for air, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. I didn't go back inside until my parents came home. I never told them what happened. I wasn't sure they would believe me, or if I even believed it myself. But one thing's for sure, being home alone has never felt the same since that night. There are some things in the dark that are better left unseen. It was a typical Friday night, and I was home alone. My parents had gone out for dinner and a movie, and I was left to my own devices. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I usually enjoyed the solitude. The house was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I decided to make some popcorn and watch a movie. After a while, I found myself getting lost in the plot. The warmth of the blanket wrapped around me, the comfort of my familiar living room. The glow from the TV was the only light in the room, casting long shadows on the walls. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard the first sound, a soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from upstairs. I paused the movie, straining my ears to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, as it often did on cold nights. But then I heard it again, this time a little louder, a distinct, deliberate creak, like a floorboard being stepped on. My heart began to race. I muted the TV, sitting perfectly still, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, coming from the hallway above me. I froze. My mind raced with all sorts of explanations. Maybe my parents had come home early. Maybe the neighbors were making noise. But I knew that wasn't it. The footsteps were inside the house, directly above me. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed my mom's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, but she didn't pick up. I hung up and tried my dad's phone. No answer. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the next set of footsteps. Now at the top of the stairs, I felt trapped, unable to move or think clearly. The logical part of my brain told me to get out of the house, to run to a neighbor's place, but I couldn't leave the living room. I just sat there, staring at the staircase, waiting for whatever was coming down. The footsteps reached the middle of the stairs and then stopped. Silence filled the house, so thick it felt like it was pressing down on me. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, but nothing came. The quiet stretched on, unbearable. Finally, I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like jelly as I moved towards the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the darkened staircase. I grabbed a knife from the drawer, my only source of comfort, and edged towards the stairs. Just as I reached the bottom step, my phone buzzed in my pocket, nearly making me jump out of my skin. I fumbled to answer it, nearly dropping the knife in the process. Hello. My voice was barely a whisper. Hey, it's Mom. We're on our way home now. We'll be there in about 10 minutes. Everything okay? I didn't know what to say. I glanced at the staircase again, but the darkness was still and quiet. Whatever had been there was gone. Yeah, I finally replied, my voice shaky. Everything's fine. When my parents got home, I told them about the footsteps, about the sound coming from upstairs. They checked the house, but there was nothing out of place, no signs of an intruder. My dad suggested it was just my imagination, maybe a dream I had while dozing off, but I know what I heard. Those footsteps were real, and someone or something was in the house with me that night. I still can't explain it, but I've never felt the same in that house again, especially when I'm alone. Being home alone has never really bothered me. In fact, I used to enjoy it. A quiet house, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But one night last winter changed that for good. It was a Saturday, and my parents were out of town for the weekend. I was curled up on the couch, binging my favorite show with a bowl of snacks by my side. The house was warm, the lights were low, and outside, the snow was falling softly. Everything felt cozy, almost perfect. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, checked that all the doors were locked, and headed upstairs to my room. The house was silent, except for the muffled hum of the heater. I crawled into bed, turned off the light, and closed my eyes. I must have been drifting off when I heard a faint knock. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. A sharp, deliberate knock on my bedroom window. I froze. My room is on the second floor, and there's no balcony, no tree outside, nothing that could explain someone knocking on that window. My heart started pounding as I lay there, listening. The knock came again, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look, but something in me needed to know what was out there. Slowly, I turned my head towards the window. The curtains were drawn, but through the thin fabric, I could see the outline of a figure, tall and moving, and definitely not something I recognized. Panic gripped me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. All I could do was stare at that shadowy shape, my mind racing. Who could it be? How did they get up there? And why were they knocking? I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I was still half asleep. But the knock came again, more insistent this time, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. Gathering every bit of courage I had, I reached over and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I dialed 911, but my thumb hovered over the call button, hesitating. What if it was nothing? What if it was just a branch brushing against the window? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Before I could press call, the knocking stopped. The figure outside the window shifted, and then, to my horror, it began to slide away, disappearing from view. I stayed frozen, listening for any other sounds, but all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to get out of bed and peek through the curtains. The snow-covered yard below was empty, and touched. There was no sign of footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next morning, I checked the window from the outside. There were no marks, no clues, nothing to suggest that someone had been there, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I never told my parents, and I've never been able to explain it. But now, whenever I'm home alone at night, I can't help but glance at that window, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing there, waiting to be let in. Being home alone never bothered me much. In fact, I usually enjoyed the quiet time to myself. But there was one night that still haunts me, a night I'll never forget. It was a cold winter evening, and my parents had gone to visit some friends, leaving me alone for a few hours. I had just settled into the living room, with a cup of hot chocolate and a movie when I heard a noise from outside. At first, it sounded like the wind, just the usual winter gusts rattling the old windows. I ignored it and kept watching my movie, but then I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the window. I paused the movie and listened. The house was silent except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. The curtains were drawn, blocking my view of the outside, but the sound was definitely coming from the window nearest to the front door. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or something, and slowly walked over to the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. I hesitated for a moment, then quickly pulled it aside. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on the other side of the glass was a figure, a man, or at least the outline of one. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the glint of his eyes reflecting the dim light from inside the house. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I took a step back, not daring to look away, as if breaking eye contact might make him do something. I quickly locked the window and grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I dialed 911, my voice barely steady enough to explain the situation to the operator. They assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. As I spoke to the operator, I kept my eyes on the man outside. He still hadn't moved, just stood there like some kind of statue. But then, as if sensing that I had called for help, he slowly lifted his hand and placed it flat against the window. His fingers splayed out like he was trying to reach through the glass. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The operator's voice on the other end of the line brought me back to reality, and I forced myself to stay calm, repeating that help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, my eyes locked on the figure outside. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling into the driveway. The man didn't react, didn't move at all, but as soon as I heard the sound of car doors slamming outside, he turned and walked away into the darkness, disappearing from view as if he had never been there at all. The police searched the area but found no trace of the man. No footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there. They assured me it was probably just a prank or someone passing through, but I knew it was more than that. There was something wrong about the way he stood there, the way he watched me. My parents came home shortly after the police left, and I told them everything. They tried to reassure me, but I could see the unease in their eyes. We double-checked all the locks and made sure every window was secure, but it didn't matter. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man would come back. Still don't know who or what I saw that night. But ever since then, I can't sit in the living room alone without thinking about that face in the window, watching, waiting. And even though nothing bad happened to me, I can't shake the fear that next time, I might not be so lucky. I had always prided myself on being independent. Being home alone wasn't a big deal for me. It was a regular occurrence, especially on nights when my parents had to work late or attend some event. I actually enjoyed the solitude. It gave me a chance to relax, watch whatever I wanted on TV, and eat whatever junk food I could find in the pantry. That night started like any other. My parents had gone out to dinner with some friends and wouldn't be back until after midnight. I ordered a pizza, grabbed a soda from the fridge, and settled into the couch with a stack of horror movies. The irony wasn't lost on me watching scary movies while home alone, but it had never bothered me before. Around 10 p.m., the movie I was watching started to lose my interest, and I found myself dozing off. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator. I was in that hazy state between wakefulness and sleep when something caught my attention. It was faint at first, so quiet I almost didn't notice it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the old house settling. But as I focused on it, the sound grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was the unmistakable sound of someone breathing deeply, slowly, in and out. My heart started to race as I muted the TV. The room fell silent, but the breathing continued. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded close to close. I sat up straight, clutching the blanket around me like a shield, and looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight. But the breathing persisted, growing louder, more defined. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My first thought was to grab my phone and call someone, anyone, but my phone was in the kitchen charging. I didn't want to move, didn't want to leave the relative safety of the couch, but the sound was getting closer, more invasive, as if it was coming from the very walls around me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had left the TV on too loud. Maybe it was just the house making strange noises. But deep down, I knew none of those things were true. The breathing was real. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I slowly stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I crept toward the kitchen, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The breathing followed me, its steady rhythm never wavering. I could hear it behind me, in front of me, around me, like it was enveloping the entire house. When I reached the kitchen, I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The ringing seemed to go on forever before she finally answered. "Hello," she said, her voice cheerful, oblivious to the fear clawing at my insides. "Mom," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think there's someone in the house." There was a pause on the other end, then her tone changed to one of concern. "What do you mean? Are you sure?" "Yes," I insisted, my voice cracking. "I can hear breathing." "Get out of the house, now," she said firmly. "Go to the neighbors, and we'll be home as soon as we can." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and hurried toward the front door. As I moved, the breathing seemed to follow me, echoing through the hallway. My hands fumbled with the lock, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to open it. But then, the door swung open, and I bolted outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but the breathing finally stopped. I ran across the street to my neighbor's house, my heart pounding in my chest. They let me in without hesitation, and I waited there until my parents came home. We called the police, but they found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house but me. They said it was probably just my imagination, maybe a dream that felt too real. But I know what I heard. To this day, I still can't explain it. I've never heard that breathing again, but the memory of it lingers, a reminder that some things in this world defy explanation. And even though nothing bad happened to me that night, I'll never forget the terror of feeling so completely alone, yet knowing I wasn't. It was a quiet Saturday night, and I was home alone. My parents had gone out to dinner with friends, leaving me with the house to myself. I had always enjoyed these moments of solitude. There was something peaceful about having the entire place to myself. I made some popcorn, grabbed a soda, and settled onto the couch to watch a movie. The first hour passed without incident. The house was silent, save for the occasional pop of the popcorn and the low hum of the refrigerator. As I was halfway through the movie, I suddenly heard a faint creaking noise. I paused the movie, listening carefully. The sound had come from somewhere in the house, but I couldn't quite pinpoint where. I dismissed it as the house settling. Old houses make noises, after all. I pressed play and tried to focus on the movie, but the noise came again, louder this time, like footsteps moving slowly across the floor. My heart started to race, and I muted the TV, straining to hear any other sounds. The footsteps were unmistakable, and they were coming from the hallway just outside the living room. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was alone. There was no one else in the house. It had to be something else, maybe a draft pushing the door slightly or a tree branch scraping against the window. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate, moving closer to the living room. My stomach knotted with fear, but I couldn't just sit there. I needed to check it out. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me, and slowly made my way to the doorway that led to the hall. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the TV behind me. I flipped the hallway light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb had burned out, leaving the hallway shrouded in shadow. For a moment, I considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. They would just tell me it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But this felt real to ignore. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder here, like someone had left a window open, but I knew that wasn't the case. I checked the windows earlier, making sure everything was locked up tight. The silence in the hallway was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I slowly walked down the hallway, trying to convince myself that I was being silly, that there was nothing there. But as I reached the end of the hall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the far end, was a shadow, a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to move. The shadow didn't make a sound, didn't shift or sway, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an intruder? But how could they have gotten in without me hearing? And how could they stand so still, so silent? I blinked, and the shadow seemed to waver, as if it was dissolving into the darkness around it. I blinked again, and it was gone. The hallway was empty, the only sound now the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned and hurried back to the living room. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, my voice shaking as I told her what I'd seen. She tried to calm me down, suggesting that it was just a trick of the light, that I was seeing things because I'd been watching a scary movie. But I knew what I saw, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the house with me. I locked myself in the living room and waited for my parents to come home. When they arrived, we searched the entire house together, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no open windows, nothing out of place. My parents assured me it was just my imagination, but even now, I can't forget that shadow in the hallway. I never found out what it was, and part of me hopes I never will. But to this day, whenever I'm home alone, I can't help but glance down that hallway, half expecting to see that shadow standing there, waiting for me.